Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be doing another poetry episode. In fact, we're going to be doing another poem by John Keats, who, if you've listened, you'll soon learn is one of my favorite, perhaps my favorite poet. A few weeks ago, we already looked at his poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, the great romantic poem about the two lovers running away. The poem we're going to look at today has some similar themes. It has to do with, obviously, romanticism, with art, with beauty. But the subject matter is quite different than two lovers. And I think this poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, is a little more nuanced in some ways than The Eve of St. Agnes. The Eve of St. Agnes, remember, we focused on the way it celebrates sensory pleasure and lush beauty in contrast to the cold frigidity of Christianity. This poem will celebrate a similar kind of lush life and romance and vibrancy, but the complexity comes from this poem's relationship to history. Because, of course, what is a Grecian urn? A Grecian urn is an urn created by the ancient Greeks, something we might find in a museum. We've all seen Grecian urns if we've been to museums, those red and black urns, those pieces of art. So Keats is writing a poem about one of those Grecian urns, and he's essentially going to use this art object that one might find in a museum and let his thoughts take him to an interesting place, in a direction where he, through his poem, ends up making a commentary on history and on beauty. So let's take a look at the poem. And just like last time when we did Robert Browning's Love Among the Ruins, this is a poem that is short enough for us to be able to read in its entirety. So this poem is 5 stanzas, and each stanza is 10 lines long. And it is written in a traditional iambic pentameter, right? The kind of classic rhythm of English poetry, which we're going to analyze. And the rhyme scheme is a little more complex, right? So the rhyme scheme of Ode on a Grecian Urn is not consistent from stanza to stanza. We're going to take note of which lines rhyme with each other and how that shifting kind of play helps Keats make certain points about the figures on the urn, the subject matter he's discussing. But let's begin here with the first stanza. So let's take a look at the very first stanza of the poem. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals or of both, in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? So that is our first stanza, in which Keats speaks directly to the urn and asks it a series of rhetorical questions about the images that haunt about its shape. But let's start with the first lines of the poem. And let's kind of break down the images that Keats uses here to characterize this Grecian urn. So first, he describes it as an unravished bride of quietness. Now, this is a fascinating opening line because, first of all, why is the urn a bride of quietness? And more specifically, an unravished bride of quietness. So ravished, of course, means, it can mean several different things. It can mean raped, but I think in this case, Keats is using it not necessarily with that violent connotation, but rather simply, ravished also means something that is still a virgin, right? Still virginal. A bride who is unravished is a bride who has not yet consummated their marriage. They remain pure. Now, obviously, these are slightly archaic ideas of femininity, and that's something we simply have to accept. Keats is a poet from the early 19th century who is writing about the classical era here. So he is going to use metaphors and images that to modern readers might be, disquieting slightly. The idea of unravished brides, right? And the idea of virginity and purity as something elevated, as an elevated state. I think to help you, right, if you're a modern reader who feels offended by some of these images or some of these comparisons that Keats is making, and this goes for anything we read, always try and approach the work of art from the perspective of the time period. During Keats's time, and for many centuries before, the idea of virginity was associated with purity. And this was a metaphor many poets and writers used. So, from our perspective, let's approach the metaphor as Keats intended and give him the benefit of the doubt. Because this is, as we're going to see, an extraordinary poem that said something very extraordinary about time and history. But to come back to unravished bride, right? So the idea is the urn is a bride of quietness. So the urn has married quietness. Why is this the case? Well, let's think about it. The urn cannot speak. The urn cannot tell us anything about the person who made it or about any of the images on it. That is why Keats phrases this first stanza as a series of questions. Because the questions, they are rhetorical questions, but they're also genuine. They are questions about what is on your shape. What is it that you have depicted on you? And the urn cannot respond. The urn is quiet. The urn is silent. It cannot respond. It is the bride of quietness. And it's unravished because, of course, the urn is intact, so to speak, to use another slightly archaic metaphor about a woman's virginity. Intact meaning the urn is still here. It has survived uncorrupted. It has not been broken. Remember, Keats is writing in the 19th century, right, in the 1800s. The ancient Greek world was as ancient for him as it is for us, right? Thousands of years old. So to Keats, it is a miracle to some extent that an urn like this survives the ravages of time, survives uncorrupted, survives unravished. So there's a few things going on in that opening line, right? On the one hand, the emphasis on the bride of quietness, but on the other hand, the unravished aspect of this urn, the pure, uncorrupted nature of this urn. Now, remember, Keats is no prude. Keats is not a traditional Christian moralist. When Keats uses the word unravished and pure, he doesn't mean it in a sexual sense, because the urn, as we're going to see, has many sexual and suggestive situations depicted on it. And Keats celebrates this sensuality and sexuality. He celebrates the urn's depiction of this beautiful love, this beautiful and eternal love, in much the same way that he celebrated Madeline and Porphyro. So don't let the word unravished and all of its connotations throw you off. I believe Keats means unravished in the sense that the urn is not broken, that the urn is still here. Now, the next stanza, he also refers to the urn as a foster child of silence and slow time. So the urn is the bride of quietness, but also the foster child of silence and slow time. Why foster child rather than simply child? Well, it suggests that the urn's parentage, the urn's parents, right, are other people, right? The urn obviously had a creator, an artist who fashioned this urn. We don't know who that artist or creator is. Instead, the urn is like a foster child, but a foster child of what? Of silence and slow time. And those two images, right, along with quietness, of course, quietness and silence are very similar, but silence and slow time are going to be characteristics that Keats returns to, especially at the end of the poem. And they're going to be really important, right? The idea is that the urn, as we said, is silent. It cannot speak, but it is also the child, the foster child of slow time. For Keats, what the urn does, and we're going to see this at the end, what the urn does is it forces us to slow down, to slow our thoughts, to try and match the pace of history, of slow time. Keats is telling us right here that the urn's relationship to time is different from our relationship to time. It is slow time, because the urn is so old and has survived for so long. It speaks of history. Right, and in the very next line, it refers to the urn as a sylvan historian. Now, sylvan is a word that is kind of associated with the forest, with nymphs and dryads. It's a kind of rustic word to some extent, a pastoral word, but specifically I think it's associated with the forest and the woods. And so the idea here is, as we're going to see, the urn has depicted on it lots of forests and woods, right, and branches and trees and boughs. And so sylvan is also conveying something about the images on the urn itself. But the word historian, so the urn is a historian. That's key. The urn is not just a piece of history, it is a historian. It teaches us, the viewer, something about history. That's what's important to Keats. It's not just an object, but an active agent in depicting history, in conveying the reality of history. I think that's very important, a very important word that Keats uses. Now, the next line, he says, "Who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme." Now, this is the comparison that Keats makes here is something we should think about as we read the whole poem. Keats is saying that the urn can express its story and its tale much better than Keats can with his poem, with his rhyme. Now, what's fascinating here, and what I like about this line, is Keats is obviously being modest, right, as any great poet and artist will do. He is staring at this urn, and the poet is feeling this sense of, whatever I say will be insufficient to express what I am seeing, right, the beauty here. And perhaps that's true, but at the same time, and this is where I sort of think you can read this line against the grain that Keats intended. The truth is, Keats's poem about the urn is now possibly more famous than the urn itself that he is writing about. Keats's rhyme has actually become sweeter than the flowery tale the urn sought to express. And whether Keats, I don't know if Keats intended this or not. By the end, I think Keats is going to make a comment on the power of art to preserve beauty for eternity. And in a way, Keats's poem has achieved that as well, whether intentionally or not. It has, much like the urn, taken this beauty and preserved it for eternity. And we're gonna see that especially when we get to the final lines. But it's a great moment here at the very beginning where he compares the poem he's writing to the urn. And he wants us to think, in this case, he wants us to think about art and what art does. Now, the rest of this is simply a series of questions, as we said, where, again, he sort of is going to vary the rhyme scheme of the final 6 lines of each of the stanzas. But the questions do a few things, right? On the one hand, they're quite literally describing what is on the urn, right? Leaf-fringed legend, right? Men or gods, maidens, mad pursuit, struggle to escape, pipes and timbrels, ecstasy. But he also creates a certain rhythm with his series of questions. Listen to the rhythm of the questions as he asks them, right? They become faster. The rhythm of the questions becomes faster and faster. So listen. What leaf-fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities or mortals or of both? in Tempe or the dales of Arcady? That's the first question, and that's 3 lines. What men or gods are these? What maidens loath? So that's 1 line, right? And it has 2 questions in it. The first and then a second shorter question. What mad pursuit? What struggle to escape? What pipes and timbrels? What wild ecstasy? So each question becomes shorter. The pace becomes faster. I think, intentionally or not, Keats is depicting a kind of orgasm, right? Or at least the building of tension, of breathiness, of speed, right? Of passion. Because passion is what the first half of this poem is going to be about. He's going to depict the kind of passion of sensual pleasure that the urn is depicting. And I think we can hear that passionate intensity in the way the questions seem to pick up in pace as this stanza moves to its close. And of course, ending on the word ecstasy is very telling. Now let's look at the next stanza now. So this is stanza 2. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but, more endeared, pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Fair youth beneath the trees, thou canst not leave thy song, nor ever can those trees be bare. Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal yet, do not grieve. She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. For ever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Now, in this stanza, so at the beginning, he kind of, again, think of the structure of each of these stanzas. The first 4 lines always have the same A-B rhyme scheme. The last 6 lines then usually shift to a more fluid rhyme scheme that often changes, right, from stanza to stanza, right? In the first stanza, the rhyme scheme of the last 6 lines were C, D, E, D, C, E. In this stanza now, the rhyme scheme of the last 6 lines is C, D, E, C, E, D, right? So very subtle kind of shifting of those rhyme schemes. What I think Keats' intention here is to make a clear distinction in these stanzas between the first 4 lines and the last 6 lines. So the first 4 lines here are setting up this idea. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Remember, silence and quietness, right? The urn cannot speak. The urn cannot make any sound. The urn cannot play music. But what Keats is saying is that the unheard melodies that are being played by this urn are sweeter than the heard ones. And now this is interesting because Keats is a poet of the senses. As we saw when we analyzed his previous poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, Keats revels in sensual pleasure, in sensory details. But this is where the nuance of this poem comes in, and why I think this poem is more nuanced than a straightforward romantic celebration of the senses. Because what he's actually saying here is that there is something beyond the senses. There is the sensual ear, right? The way we hear music. But when we stare at an urn like this, Keats is saying that the urn is resounding with music that we don't hear in our sensual ear, but that is more endeared. The spirit ditties of no tone. So Keats is suggesting that by dint of being a historical object, by dint of being such a beautiful historical object, an intact and complete historical object, this urn is actually more powerful in its silence. Keats is suggesting is that there is something beyond the senses. When we look at this urn, we feel something beyond the senses. Now, what do we feel? The last 6 lines kind of depict for us what is happening on the urn. There's a youth beneath the trees. He's playing a song. But what is Keats' emphasis here? He's saying the youth can never leave his song. The trees can never be bare. There's also a lover, and it could be that the lover is the youth. It could be that the lover is someone else, right? The lover can never kiss So we imagine that there's a lover kind of pursuing a girl, pursuing a woman. He can never kiss her, right? Because the urn is frozen as it is. The images will not move. But what does Keats say? She cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss. Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. So for Keats, the kind of frozenness of this moment on the urn is actually wonderful because it preserves these figures for eternity, right? She will never fade. The trees will never be bare. Now, the question to ask is, what does the second half of this stanza have to do with the first? Because there is a colon separating the first 4 lines with the last 6. So it is our job as readers to try and draw a connection. The first 4 lines, right, we said talked about the sensual ear versus the spirit, right? That there's something deeper than the senses. The last 6 lines then talk about eternity. They talk about how the urn has taken these figures and preserved them for eternity. So I think the connection Keats is drawing is that beyond the senses lies eternity, right? Beyond the senses lies eternity. Because the senses, as much as he glorifies the senses, obviously, in a lot of his poems, and even in this one to some extent, as much as he glorifies the senses, obviously sensuality is associated with something bodily, something earthly, and by definition, the bodily and the earthly are mortal, right? They do fade. The tree does shed its leaves. The song does end. And the woman does fade. The lovers do fade. But not on the urn. So in a way, I think what Keats is saying is that, well, how do we preserve eternity? How do we achieve this kind of immortality? We have to go beyond the senses, which is the complexity of this poem, because this is also a poem describing something that Keats is seeing, right? He is describing things visual. But for him, it's not just the visuals that make the urn what it is. It is something spiritual that he is experiencing beyond his senses. That is bringing him closer to eternity. And I think for us, as we read this, the same thing is happening. We are also coming closer to eternity as we go beyond the senses and enter the world of the spirit, which this poem is opening for us. Now let's read the third stanza. Ah, happy, happy boughs that cannot shed your leaves, nor ever bid the spring adieu, and happy melodist, unwearied, forever piping songs forever new, more happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above, that leaves a heart high sorrowful and cloyed, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Now, I believe in this stanza we have the pivot of the poem. This is the third stanza. This is the middle stanza of the poem. And I believe in this poem we experience the dramatic shift from happiness at the beginning to something else at the end. And we're going to talk about what that something else is. But let's start with the first 4 lines, as we always do, right? The structure, once again, of all of these stanzas. The first 4 lines follow the same pattern, right? A, B, A, B, the same rhyme scheme. And they simply, again, emphasize what the last few lines have emphasized, that the boughs are happy. He uses the word happy 4 times in this stanza. No, 5 times in this stanza. He uses the word happy 5 times. No, sorry, 6 times. He uses the word happy 6 times. The boughs are happy. The melodist is happy. Love is happy. There's a lot of happiness in this poem, at least in the first half. Happy, happy boughs. And why are they happy? Because they can't shed their leaves. They're eternal, as we said. It will always be spring for these leaves. The melodist is happy because he's unwearied. He's always going to be piping songs. Love is happy because love is always going to be enjoyed. But let's talk about what happens to love in the last 6 lines of the poem, because this is where we have the shift. So, more happy love, more happy, happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young. I want to focus on the word panting. That is an explicitly sexual word. There is no denying what Keats is going for there. He's describing sex. He's describing the panting of sex, of lovemaking. And for him, in a way, the urn, it's almost like the urn is getting him to think, yes, these lovers will be panting forever. They will be forever young. They will be forever panting, all breathing human passion far above. Right? And what happens? The heart is left high, sorrowful, and cloyed. So what does the word cloyed mean? When we say something is cloyed, right? When we describe something as cloying, it's actually a negative word. That it's almost like there's an excess of something pleasant that leaves us feeling cloyed. It's when something is too sweet, right? When something is excessively sweet, it becomes cloying. And our forehead burns and our tongue is parched. We become thirsty. What Keats is describing here in this stanza, I think, is the natural progression of sex for a human being. Yes, at first we are happy, we are thrilled, we are warm, we are enjoying ourselves, we are panting, we feel young forever. But inevitably, because time is real for human beings, inevitably we pass into the next state, right? He kind of gets at the unexplainable but sometimes natural sorrowfulness that might follow the sex act, the feeling of being cloyed, this oversweetness that we seem to be in, right? Our burning forehead, our desire for water, our thirstiness. What Keats is saying here is that we are not like the lovers on the urn, and we can never be. Because for us, we are humans. Inevitably, we have to experience the burning forehead, the parching tongue, the heart high sorrowful, and the cloying feeling. What are the people on the urn? They are breathing human passion far above. Far above what? Well, far above our world. In this world of the spirit, where they can experience this eternally, where they can experience this love forever. And again, it goes back to that distinction earlier that Keats set up in the previous stanza. The lovers on the urn are not experiencing sensual pleasure the way we do. They exist somewhere beyond the human world, beyond the senses, in this world of the spirit where there is no sensual ear, right, or sensual feeling. Their sensual feelings are different from ours because for us it is inevitable that we come down from this ecstasy. So think of the words he's used so far. Ecstasy, right, in the early one, and then all the uses of happy here. I think what Keats depicts through the rhythms and the sound of and the rhyme scheme of this stanza and the structure of this stanza is an orgasm. He depicts an orgasm, and then he depicts the come down from an orgasm, right? We're feeling more happy love, more happy love, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passion far above. It's like the tension is building, and then the last two lines release it. It's like the exhale of breath, the inevitable exhale of breath that human beings have to experience. Think of also the rhyme scheme that he uses, right? He rhymes the word enjoyed with the word cloyed, right? So this contrasting rhyme scheme. We enjoyed, but now we feel cloyed. And then the word young is rhymed with tongue. So young to emphasize that we can be forever young, but then contrasted with the parching tongue, the inevitable human need for sustenance, for water, the inevitable parching tongue. So he's creating this contrast even in the rhyme scheme itself. So then two more stanzas now, and now the poem shifts gears a bit. We can feel it in this next stanza. We are no longer in the beautiful, lush, pastoral, sexual world of those second and third stanzas. The next stanza shifts to a very different kind of tone. Who are these coming to the sacrifice? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies? and all her silken flanks with garlands dressed. What little town by river or sea-shore, or mountain built with peaceful citadel, is emptied of its folk this pious morn? And little town, thy streets forevermore will silent be, and not a soul to tell why thou art desolate can e'er return. So now we have a depiction of another section of the urn. We have to imagine he's looking at different parts of the urn. Now he's looking at a group of, basically like a procession led by a priest, right, coming to perform a sacrifice, right? They're leading this heifer, her flanks are dressed in garlands. But what does he ask, right? He's framing this as a series of questions, right? Rhetorical questions. Remember, the opening stanza also began as questions, right? So he asks first the priest this question, right? To what green altar, O mysterious priest, leadst thou that heifer lowing at the skies? But what about the next question? Where does he go from here? He doesn't actually focus on the priest. He starts to focus on the little town which must have been emptied of its folk. Now, this is interesting because he kind of goes beyond the urn now and starts to imagine, well, okay, what there would have been in the world of this urn, right? There would have been a town by a river or a seashore or by a mountain, and all the people, all the citizens of that town have emptied. All the citizens of that town, all the people who live in that town have left because they are here for the sacrifice in this procession. And what does he say? Well, it's almost wistful. He says that little town is always now going to be silent. And there's not going to be a single person who's going to be able to explain why thou art desolate. Who is the thou in that case? It's not the urn. It's the town. So originally the word thou made a reference to the urn. He was talking to the urn. Now he's talking about the town. In a way, so why is this the case? What is happening here? There's a few ways I think we can interpret this. On the one hand, the urn has made him think of the world beyond the urn, right? In other words, if we think of the urn as kind of this doorway to this spiritual understanding and perception of history and of time, well, now he starts to think about the past. He starts to imagine an actual town where people might have lived, which has been emptied for this sacrifice, right? Now he starts to think in that context. And he feels melancholy. He feels wistful. And so let's think about the idea of eternity, right? Why is the town always going to be silent? Why are the town's streets forevermore silent? It's because the urn is eternal. So earlier, eternity was seen as something positive, as this idea of the lovers will be lovers forever, the trees will never be bare, the sex will go on forever, right? And it's beautiful. But now we've shifted. Now suddenly eternity is cold to Keats. Eternity is cold because it means there is a town somewhere that is desolate. Keats is not thinking of the urn anymore, he's thinking of the town. He's thinking of this human world beyond the urn that is now empty of its folk, because the people from that town have passed into and onto the urn, have become eternal on the urn. They will always be here, just like the lovers. The priest will always be leading this sacrifice to the green altar. But for Keats, that's no longer something kind of beautiful or profound. It's not a beautiful celebration of eternity. It's something melancholy. It's something that makes him feel desolate, right? He says the town is desolate, but in a way, he is desolate, right? He is feeling sad here. And again, think of the structure of this stanza. It's the same beautiful structure. The first 4 lines introduce the priest, and the last 6 lines discuss the town. So once again, right, the intelligence of the structure of this poem. Sometimes when we read a poem like this, it just feels so natural. It feels like it just flows. But when you break down the lines, you see, Keats thought about what is he going to talk about in the first 4 lines? What is he going to talk about in the last 6 lines? How is he going to make this distinction? And how is he going to relate those two together? All right, let's look at the final stanza and then kind of reflect on the poem more broadly. So the last stanza now. O Attic shape, fair attitude, with braid of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. All right, so this is obviously the great stanza that brings it all together, so let's break it down. So first, he begins by addressing the urn directly, right? O Attic shape, fair attitude, right? He's kind of praising the urn's appearance, the urn's shape, and he celebrates the braid of marble men and maidens, but then he uses the word overwrought. So why the word overwrought? Because what does overwrought mean? When we say something is overwrought, it actually means it is too emotional. It's very much like the word cloyed that he used earlier. And this is part of the tension of the poem. It's not simply a celebration of sensory experience and sensory pleasure in the same way that the Eve of St. Agnes was. It's not so simple because for Keats, the sensory delight, the men and maidens, it's actually cloying. It's overwrought. It's too much for him. He feels that the urn is too much. Now, this is interesting. This is the complexity of the poem, the tension. It's not simply that the urn is beautiful. I think people often misread this poem because they focus just on those final lines about beauty and truth. And yes, that's kind of the key to the poem. But to understand what he means about beauty and truth, we have to read and think about what he means up to that point. It is not simply a celebration of the urn's beauty, because he believes the urn is actually overwrought. He's overwhelmed by the urn. He feels that there is too much on the urn. The forest branches, the trodden weed. What does he say? It teases us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. Now, this stanza structure is slightly different than the others, right? It's actually these first 5 lines and then the last 5 lines. So it's not divided 4 and 6, but actually much more 5 and 5. Now, the rhyme scheme, though, so the rhyme scheme still follows the same structure as a lot of the previous stanzas, but the structure is different, right? It's really those first 5 lines that end on the phrase cold pastoral that sum up the first half of the stanza. Right, he says, again, he emphasizes that the urn is a silent form. He returns to the idea of silence, only now the silence is more complex, as we saw, right? It's no longer just this beautiful, unravished bride of quietness. It's now a silent form that is so profound, but also so profoundly alienating that it teases us out of thought. In other words, Keats is, again, think of the word overwrought. Think of how Keats feels overwhelmed at this point as a viewer. He's sort of saying, it's like looking at eternity. We look at this urn and it feels like looking at eternity. It teases us out of thought. There's nothing, we can't even think anymore because we're face to face with eternity. And this beautiful phrase, cold pastoral. It's a brilliant use of a paradox, of an oxymoron. Because pastoral imagery is supposed to be warm and sensual and beautiful, right? The idea of pastoral, it's really meant to celebrate kind of the idyllic world of shepherds, right? Love Among the Ruins was a pastoral, right? And it was not a cold pastoral, it was a warm pastoral, celebrating the beauty of life that the shepherds represent. Keats is saying, no, this is a cold pastoral. Because of course the urn is cold. The sensual details on the urn, remember what he said earlier, it's not actually sensual, it's beyond the senses. And previously Keats seemed to celebrate the movement beyond the senses into the spirit world, right? The idea of eternity. Now he comes to this realization that eternity is cold. Eternity is cold pastoral. It doesn't have the sensual warmth of real life. It is cold. Because that's what the urn would feel like if you were to touch it. It would be cold to human beings. And I think in this phrase, cold pastoral, is contained all the complexity of this beautiful poem. When we look at an urn, a piece of history, we might first feel this kind of wonderment, right, at what it represents, at the fact that it survived unravished, at the images that we see. But if we really think about it, Keats is saying we come to this point where we feel this chill, we feel this coldness in the face of something that is eternal, something that has survived forever. You know, Keats is not a religious poet in the sense that, you know, his poems are not celebrations of Christianity, even though he makes a lot of references to religion. I think for Keats, the closest he comes to sort of this religious spirituality is in a poem like this, where the urn is God to him. The urn is eternity, right? And it, like a lot of spiritual encounters, for a lot of people, it leaves him feeling cold. So then let's read these last 5 lines. And how does he conclude this poem? So he says, "When old age shall this generation waste." So now he starts to think about his death. Because remember, he's come face to face with eternity in the form of this urn. And what does he think of? He thinks of his own mortality. Because that's what we think of when we think of eternity. When we see some beautiful work of art that has survived for thousands of years, we realize it's survived for thousands of years, but I will not. I will die because I am human. I am mortal. So he says, when old age shall all of us waste, because he knows that all of us will die. That's what he wants us to think about. We will all die. Keats obviously died very young, right? Didn't even reach old age, which is the deeper level of irony here. But even for us reading this today, I mean, yeah, we will all die. We will one day reach old age. It will waste us. But the urn will remain. And not just the urn, but this poem will remain, because that was the original comparison, remember, Keats made at the beginning. The urn, he compared his poem to the urn in a self-deprecating way, but ironically, his poem has achieved the kind of immortality that he associated with the urn. Thou, meaning the urn, shall remain, and the poem is remaining too, in midst of other woe than ours. And how does he conclude then? So how does he move beyond cold pastoral? Because cold pastoral was quite a sad phrase. But here he says, you know what? You will be a friend to man. So why is the urn a friend after all of this? Because it seemed like earlier Keats felt alienated by the urn, by the overwrought nature of the urn. He felt pushed out of thought, teased out of thought. He felt that the urn was cold. So the conclusion he comes to is that even though that's the case, even though he feels this alienation, even though he feels the urn is overwrought and cold, it is still a friend. And why is it a friend? It's because the urn, according to Keats, tells us, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth and all ye need to know. So what does that mean? This is a very famous line that gets celebrated as the spirit of romanticism. And in many ways it is, right? A celebration of beauty as the only form of truth. Because for Keats, right, how has he come face to face with eternity? He has come face to face with eternity, not through God, but through looking at a work of art from the past, a beautiful work of art that has survived. And it is through this beauty that he reached this understanding of eternity, right? And for Keats, as much as that left him feeling cold, he knows at the end that it's a good thing to experience this when we look at a work of art. Because for him, beauty is the only path to truth, right? That in order to understand truth, and for him, truth is what he just understood, right? Truth is when you come face to face with eternity, truth is the idea that we will all die. And what was his path to reach that truth? It was experiencing and witnessing beauty. And so I think the ending to this poem is not exactly like people interpret it. People hear this phrase, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, and they think, oh, It's a hedonistic celebration of beauty. It's an argument that there is nothing divine in the world, that it is all about pleasure, that it is all about this world and the beauty of this world. No, it's actually so different than that. What Keats is saying is that, no, there is a truth. It's the truth that he reached in this poem, that we will all die, that we are not eternal, but that we are mortal. But what the last lines mean is that the path to reach this truth is coming face to face with beauty, for Keats in the form of this urn. For us, we might have our own versions of this, our own variations. I know that I have felt some kind of experience similar to the one Keats felt here in a museum, looking at a work of art, right? Not just reveling in the beauty of it, but then feeling this coldness as I realize my own mortality in contrast to this beauty that is eternal. And that's the beauty of this poem. This is a poem about how to look at a piece of art and the way that a piece of art can reveal to us the truth about time and history and the truth about the spirit. And that's what makes this poem so beautiful and so profound. All right, so I think that's a perfect note to end on. We're going to do more poems by John Keats in the future. As you can probably tell, he is one of my favorites. I think what you can do is you can take what we've talked about here and apply it to a lot of the novels that we read, right? How do the works of art that we experience and read make us feel similar kinds of things to what Keats is describing here? How do they make us feel the idea of eternity? And trace your emotional reaction to poems, paintings, pieces of art that you experience, and see if you can recognize the same feelings that Keats describes here. I think when you sort of trace them the way Keats does, when you make note of them the way he does, you realize how profound and complex our relationship to art really is. And you can do that with a lot of the novels that we read for this podcast. All right, so thank you all for listening. As always, if you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share the podcast. And I will see you all next week.